I'm Brad Stone in San Francisco, in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, security breach at Facebook. The social media network says up to 50 million accounts were affected by the incursion, which allowed hackers to take over a member's account. Plus, the SEC sues Elon Musk over his infamous tweet suggesting he'll take the company private, sending Tesla shares into a free fall. And U.S. lawmakers finally get their chance to grill the Google CEO, but behind closed doors. We'll discuss what Sundar Pichai likely said when he visited the Hill. But first, to our top story, more drama for Facebook. The social network says it has discovered a security breach that affected almost 50 million accounts. The company said it's investigating the breach, which allowed hackers to take over a person's account. CEO Mark Zuckerberg held a call earlier related to security. Here's what he had to say.
Now, this is a serious issue, and we've already taken a number of steps to address this. First, we patched the security vulnerability to prevent this attacker or any other attacker from being able to steal additional access tokens, and we invalidated the access tokens for the accounts of the up to 50 million people who were affected, causing those people to be logged out.
Joining us now to discuss Bloomberg Technology's Jordan Robertson, who covers cybersecurity. Also with us, Pivotal's Brian Weezer, joining now over the phone. Jordan, let's start with you. What have we learned today about this breach at Facebook?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Brad. What we've learned today is that Facebook had a really nasty network intrusion into potentially 50 million people's Facebook accounts. Now, to put that into context, you hear a lot of big numbers around cybersecurity. Yahoo lost 3 billion accounts. Hundreds of millions of accounts get compromised via credit cards and things like that. 50 million for Facebook is not a huge number on its own, but the type of access these hackers were able to gain, which was full account takeover, is what makes this really significant. And the mechanism they used, it was essentially a flaw in Facebook's coding that allowed them to effectively, look up an account, steal an access token to that account, and log in as the user. For social media breaches, this is kind of as bad as it gets.
Jordan, let's compare it to the Cambridge Analytica breach that was revealed earlier this year, probably better known at this point. Those hackers, for lack of a better word, had access to a user's public profile, right? If that was inadvertently shared by one of their friends who took one of those famous quizzes. How does the scale and the scope of this attack compare to what happened earlier in the year?
Right. Yeah. I watched the Cambridge Analytica stuff. We obviously covered a lot of it. And some of it was a little puzzling to me because, what those researchers were able to scrape, which they weren't allowed to scrape, but what they're able to scrape is, as you say, public data from people's public Facebook profiles. So the reason people went so crazy about that is because of what that data was used for, which was the successful election campaign of Donald Trump. What Facebook has disclosed today, again, and I can't stress this enough, is that this hack allowed the attackers to access fully potentially up to 50 million people's accounts. That means log in as them, send messages as them, download all the photos, access contact lists. That's really, really nasty stuff. Facebook works very hard to prevent people from logging into accounts that don't belong to them. And this flaw in their coding allowed hackers to access potentially as many 50 million people's accounts. It's nasty stuff.
Brian, let me turn to you over the phone. I think it's fair to say you have not been the most optimistic analyst about Facebook's prospects this year. You have a negative rating on the stock. I imagine today's news does very little to change your perception.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's so hard to say if this could have happened to anyone with a platform like Facebook. But it's safe to say that I have been cataloging and rolling up over the last 2 years what I've called a taxonomy of mismanagement, where there's all these little things which collectively roll up into a pretty obvious picture that the company is not well managed, full stop. And I don't think investors appreciate that yet. Something like this will have essentially no commercial consequences, I don't think. I don't think by itself it's not going to cause advertisers to stop spending money. it's not like fines, if there were any, that might follow from this would be enough to put a dent in them. But where I think there actually could be some consequences from an overall business model perspective is that have they been skirting on costs in order to break stuff and move fast, essentially. And I think that's whether you look at the absence of content moderation, to make sure that people aren't getting killed in a genocide in Myanmar, or making sure that Instagram isn't recommending child abuse videos, or make sure that they actually know who their customers are and whether or not they're violating various laws related to advertising. They've automated so much stuff and haven't baked in enough process to actually ensure that problems don't happen on a persistent basis. They've barely begun to account for the costs that they will need to incur to make sure that the business is run to prevent as much as plausible this sort of thing. But even then, it just doesn't seem like they're making a lot of great choices.
Right. Well, they have talked about doubling their security staff to 20,000 people, Brian. But so what you're saying, though, is we perhaps don't know the impact that will have on the business model.
I think the bigger problem is I don't trust that when they say they need 20,000 people that that's the right number. Because even they need 2,500 people in Germany alone to look for Holocaust denial. Like, is 20,000 going to be enough to cover the world? I doubt it.
Jordan, let me ask you one last final question. I was one of those 90 million Facebook users who got automatically logged out of Facebook last night. They took that as a precaution. If you find out you were impacted by this hack, what do you do?
Well, I think, as you say, Facebook has actually been very proactive in disclosing this breach. I mean, it wasn't long ago that they discovered it. They were proactive in changing the access tokens for up to 90 million people, as you say. So I think that's all really good. I think that's a positive step. In terms of what you're supposed to do, I think the bigger lesson from a lot of these breaches needs to be, a lot of focus is paid to, well, did anybody steal my data? Did they steal my messages? Did they do these things? These are nation-state hackers typically that will expend the kind of resources to do these types of attacks. So the bigger question needs to be, if somebody accesses your account to spy on you, would they get what they're looking for? Do you share so much information with these social media companies that if a foreign spy were to look at your account, would they get what they're looking for? And if you hold some information back from these companies, you can maintain a sense of privacy while still enjoying the platforms. But in terms of the security protocols, they've done a good job.
Okay, scary stuff. Sorry, go ahead, Brian, quickly.
Sorry to interrupt, but an important point. I don't think they get brownie points for letting consumers know within 3 days, because under GDPR, if they did not within 72 hours, and there's any Europeans in there, the fines would have been massive. This is mission critical for any company they have to let consumers know within 72 hours.
Okay, good point. Bloomberg's Jordan Robertson and Pivotal's Brian Wieser. Thank you both for joining us. Coming up, the SEC is suing Elon Musk, raising the possibility of the company losing its iconic founder. What this means for the future of Musk at Tesla. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. Shares of Tesla have fallen the most since 2015. The SEC has accused CEO Elon Musk of misleading investors with a tweet last month about taking the electric car maker private. Regulators want to ban him from serving as director or officer at a public company. Musk called the action unjustified. For more, we're joined now by Gene Munster, founder of Loop Ventures. Also with us, Teresa Goody, former SEC attorney and founder and CEO of the Goody Group. Gene, let's start with you. I guess we could say lawsuit secured. But the Tesla stock is down dramatically today, as much as 12% at one point. Investors seem to be making some assumptions about how this is going to turn out. What do you think about those assumptions? Are they premature?
Well, I think for the near term, for investors who are thinking of the next 3 months, it's understandable that the stock is down like it is, because this is going to obviously weigh on some investors' decision. And unfortunately, it probably will take longer than 3 months. This may likely go on for a year. I think the bigger picture, and I think what investors need to really get their heads around, is a situation where Elon is still part of the company, still is an employee of Tesla, a visionary role, and maybe him not being as an officer, CEO, or director of the board. I actually think that that would be a positive, because I think that there needs to be some structural changes, something that we've been advocating for the last couple months. But ultimately, it's understandable that the stock is where it is. We're still believers here that Tesla will survive, that the company is making progress on its fundamentals, which we're going to hear more about on next Monday as they talk about their production report. And I think that that will probably shift at least the focus for the near term back to the fundamentals.
Teresa, let me ask you, you were an attorney in the SEC's General Counsel office. What do you make of these reports of a close settlement between Tesla and the SEC, where Tesla would have to agree to some provisions and Elon would have to give up the chairmanship, and then according to these reports, Tesla pulled out of that agreement? What does that tell you?
Well, the fact that he pulled out of the agreement, it looked like actually a pretty good deal for him given the SEC's complaint. I think the SEC's complaint is very well drafted. It's very clean and clear case of fraud. And it actually is drafted pretty well as a foundation for a criminal indictment. So I think the fact that he pulled out of this, it seems like it was probably something he should have taken.
Well, let's look at that more closely. What would the implications be of a criminal indictment, and why do you see kind of the outlines or the shadow of a criminal charge in what the SEC filed yesterday?
Well, the SEC's complaint is very clear that there were numerous violations of purposefully omitting information, materially misleading statements to investors, and that he willfully did it. And a willful violation of the securities laws is actually a criminal violation. I also found it interesting that they filed this in the Southern District of New York. The investigation was reported to be ongoing in California in the San Francisco office, but the action was actually brought in New York, which is a much more preferred forum for securities fraud cases. And it also works in tandem oftentimes with the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office in bringing the companion criminal cases. And of course there, the Deputy Assistant U.S. Attorney is former SEC Director of Enforcement Rob Khuzami. So there's some indications here that with the ongoing criminal investigation, oftentimes when the criminal investigation begins, as we've heard the inquiry has, that's because the SEC has found a reasonable basis that criminal activity could have occurred, and then they go ahead and pass that information on to the DOJ. And this way in which the SEC formed and drafted its complaint is a very good foundation for a criminal indictment in setting forth all of the elements.
Gene, considering the scenario that Teresa is outlining here, do we have to consider the possibility of a Tesla without Elon Musk? And what does that look like for the company?
Well, we need to consider it, but I think it's a very small probability. I'd be curious in Teresa's perspective that I haven't heard, there's the criminal side of this, but as far as removing him from Tesla altogether, that doesn't seem to be front and center here. Removing his officership and some sort of director role is part of it. But so to answer your question, Brad, is I don't think my perspective is investors should not be worried that Elon is going to be removed entirely from the company. I think that they should be making the safe bet that he will not hold any, and we're putting the odds of this at 50-50. There's still a lot of litigation to go through here, but we're saying kind of a 50-50 that he retains his CEO. Again, I think that that's actually best for the company. So when you put all this together, I don't think that the Tesla story, as bad as all of this sounds, and I think he should pay a big fine for what he has done, but as bad as all this sounds, I don't think it materially changes the long-term trajectory of Tesla.
Teresa, are there any precedents that you know of that we can look at as a guide to how this might be resolved?
Well, we can look back. People have been talking about Martha Stewart. They've been talking about the Theranos and the fact that there are officer and director bars that go forward. It's more unusual to have a permanent officer and director bar, which is what the SEC appears to be going for here. But I think we can look to that to see that it doesn't matter whether somebody is a celebrity, how innovative their technology may seem, or anything, that once you partake in this kind of conduct, that the SEC is egregious, it is going to seek to remove you as a director or officer of any public company, and that's for the protection of the shareholders, and that's for the protection of the market.
Let me jump in for a second. A question for Teresa is protection, and when you talk about protection of the shareholders, do you think shareholders are better off, shareholders of Tesla are better off if Elon Musk is completely removed from the company?
I think that Tesla would have a very difficult time having its founder and visionary removed from the company. But that is also a separate analysis from the legal implications when somebody breaks the law and the protection to the market and those investors when somebody doesn't take their duties and obligations as a public company CEO the way that they should, and they don't fulfill those obligations. So whether or not he is capable or he will fulfill those obligations that enable him to be a public officer is something separate than whether the company, in its strategic and going forward business sense, whether or not he would be good for it in that way. So there's two separate different analyses going on here, but you can't just break the law and think that because you're a very smart businessman and you're very innovative that the law doesn't apply to you.
Okay, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Loop Ventures' Gene Munster and former SEC attorney and CEO of the Goody Group, Teresa Goody, thank you both for joining us. Coming up, BlackBerry continues to look beyond phones for its future. We'll hear from the company's CEO next. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. BlackBerry shares received a boost after the company's latest earnings beat estimates and outlined how the mobile phone maker is expanding into new markets, including security software and healthcare. BlackBerry CEO John Chen spoke with BNN's John Ehrlichman earlier.
Yeah, this and many other quarters, I look at it in a much more of a longer-term trend. But this quarter, obviously, majority, I think 95, 98, 99% of our business are software and security. So the feels pretty good about it.
Now, there are so many sectors of your business where you're focused on winning business. Banking is a great example. We saw some wins in that area during the quarter. A few years ago, a lot of the headlines would read BlackBerry losing hardware business on Wall Street to, say, Apple and the iPhone. Do you feel, though, now on the software side, you're winning business back on Wall Street?
Yes, absolutely. We basically, all the top firms, not only on Wall Street, but investment banking firms around the world and banks uses BlackBerry software to manage everything. Managing BlackBerry phones and iPhones and Android phones and Windows phones and all kinds of environment. And we're extending that to endpoint management. So everything we're getting with Linux and everything else around, we're using power by them. It's also part of actually part of what we're winning today. So yes, the answer to your question is absolutely we're winning back our Wall Street customer.
Now, you've had a lot of wins just on the business you already have. There's a lot of conversations always about possibly using some of your cash for acquisitions. I heard you on your conference call said you're cheap. I know that's not in reference to birthday gifts, but it's just in terms of the valuations for possible businesses to buy. How much money would you be willing to earmark to try to continue this software growth for things like acquisitions?
Well, we have $2.4 billion, and the good news is we're generating cash, a little bit of cash every quarter. We have about $600 million of a convertible debt. So, at a minimum, we're willing to spend $1.8 billion of the net cash for the acquisition. I don't think we should limit it from that perspective. I think it's really about the values. If the values are there, we'll spend as little or as much as we possibly can afford to get into, to expand our business.
Now, you've got a patent portfolio side to the business as well. A lot of people have highlighted some of the legal battles taking place, one directed at Facebook. Meanwhile, Facebook battled back with you. I know you're not commenting specifically on that legal action, but just at the CEO level, why have these kind of battles through the lawyers? Is there not an opportunity to pick up the phone, call someone like Mark Zuckerberg, try to settle some of these differences?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love to. I wouldn't comment, like you point out. I wouldn't comment on any specific lawsuit that's going on. But in general, 99.999% of the time, we settle it amicably using business. Business will settle it, not a legal settlement. But in some cases, the other side just are not willing to address the business side of the equation, and only wanted to settle on legal side, then we'll have to do what we need to do for our shareholder.
Now, one of the other areas of growth for your business has been inside the car, maybe the car of the future, but even the car of today, using more of the BlackBerry and the QNX software. Obviously, there's a lot of trade tensions, trade friction between countries like Canada and the U.S. We've heard President Trump again this week cite that threat of auto tariffs. As someone whose business depends on a healthy auto sector right now, any message to the Trump administration when it comes to that threat of auto tariffs?
I think just in general, any tariff it is not a good outcome for businesses, and all the conversation is going on is adding uncertainty, and uncertainty is never good for businesses. I'm sure that they all know that very well. They all have their political reason to do what they need to do, and I'm not a politician, so I couldn't really comment on that. But I wish that they would settle it very quickly. Now, as far as my auto business, the good news is our business is global. About the only thing that could negatively affect us, because we don't build cars, is the number of cars built being reduced. As long as the number of car builds not being reduced, which means that maybe the cars are built in the local countries for their consumption, we'll still be okay.
BlackBerry CEO John Chen speaking with BNN Bloomberg's John Ehrlichman. Coming up, Facebook fallout. Hackers breached 50 million user accounts, and it comes at a time when Congress has big tech in its sights. Will regulation follow? We discuss. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Brad Stone in San Francisco, in for Emily Chang. Back to our top story, the revelation that Facebook data breach compromised 50 million accounts. A hack that the social media giant says it has fixed. Nevertheless, this comes at a time of big tech firms like Facebook, Google, and others facing increased scrutiny over how they're protecting their users' data. To discuss in Washington, Mark Rotenberg, president of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, and in New York, Bloomberg opinion columnist Shira Ovide. Mark, let's start with you on the news of the day, this Facebook breach. What do you make of it, and how, in your opinion, has Facebook handled it so far?
Well, of course, I'm sorry to see this news. We've been working for many years to try to strengthen privacy protections for the personal data that's collected by internet firms like Facebook. But I also have real concern at this point that the Federal Trade Commission here in Washington actually could have done something to stop this from happening. There's a pending order against Facebook to protect data. FTC said back in March, after Cambridge Analytica, they were going to reopen the investigation, but 6 months have passed. There's been no report, there's been no fine, and now we have another data breach. So we can talk about what Facebook should have done, but I think we should also start talking about what the Federal Trade Commission should do.
Shira, I'm tempted to just ask you, can Facebook catch a break in 2018?
Well, on the one hand, a day of chaos in Washington is maybe a good day to announce a massive security vulnerability. But no, it does seem like Facebook keeps stepping in it, and it's contributing to this loss of faith that we've seen at Facebook this year, these repeated scandals. And it does seem like Facebook did the right thing this time with the security vulnerability, that it disclosed it relatively quickly. It said it's investigating and notified law enforcement. It went through all the appropriate steps. But anytime you have the words Facebook and security vulnerability in the same headline in 2018, it brings up all those old concerns about Cambridge Analytica, about Russian propaganda around the election, around all kinds of data misuse at Facebook. And it just underscores that this loss of trust in Facebook is not something that's going to be re-won anytime soon.
So, Mark, as Facebook is explaining this data breach, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, is in D.C. meeting with 24 lawmakers. It's kind of an omnibus meeting. You've got privacy, you've got its efforts in China, you've got the issue of like an ideological bias slanted against conservatives. But let's take the privacy issue. What kind of questions will Sundar get, and what does he have to answer for in terms of Google and privacy?
Well, I think the privacy issue is actually the big issue. I know he was brought to Washington to address some of the concerns about anti-conservative bias on the search platform. But what the state attorney generals want to talk about, and I think what others want to talk about, is what's going to happen with the personal data that Google is collecting, still not subject to privacy protection, and also the recent news of this project in China called Dragonfly, which I got to say, I've been doing privacy stuff for a long time, but it's still possible to be scared. And Dragonfly is scary because what Google was proposing to do for the Chinese government was not only to keep all search histories, but to tie all search records to identifiable users using their telephone number. And that would be essentially perfect surveillance for the use of the internet. Google said that they're not sure this is going to go ahead. There's been a lot of question about it. Their privacy officer, Kevin Enright, testified this week in the Senate Commerce Committee. But I think lawmakers are going to ask about that as well. That is not a good direction for a U.S. firm to be heading.
Yeah, well, and let's be clear, if China does want to, if Google does want to compete in China, it probably thinks it needs to play by the rules of the game there, and so it's creating a search engine that would please the Chinese government. But Shira, let me just ask you, why? Why does Google want to go back into China? It left in 2010. The search market there is basically lost to Baidu. What do you think the company's strategic goals are?
I got to tell you, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, is why is Google doing this? It can't possibly believe that it's going to make a dent in the search market in China, where, as you said, Baidu rules. And Google was losing market share even in 2010 when it got hacked to bits and pulled out of the country. So from what I understand, Google believes it wants to do other kinds of business in China. It believes that its artificial intelligence and cloud and maybe other business-to-business kind of services that Google provides, China is a fertile and wide-open market for those kinds of Google services. And I guess it believes that it needs to do search if it does AI and cloud and other things in China. I don't necessarily see how the two are connected, but I'm not in those negotiations with China. But the problem is that, Google has just been incredibly disingenuous about its explorations of resuming search in China, and it has been justifiably raked over the coals in Washington for some of the work it has done internally to prepare for if and when that happens. And there's so many questions about what Google might do in China that Google has entirely sidestepped.
Mark, is there any conscientious way for Google to go to China?
Well, I think it should continue to promote internet use and access to information online without restriction. Those are very important values. They're universal values. I think they're respected in the technical and engineering community. There's always a need, of course, to accommodate local governments when you move into their markets. But I was really taken aback here because Google really has pushed for a number of years to oppose censorship. And now with China, they are developing what would be the world's most advanced surveillance search service. And that just can't be right.
Shira, let me ask you one last question here as we're nearly running out of time. This question of ideological bias, do conservatives have a legitimate reason to be concerned about this?
I would say yes and no. So I don't think there's legitimacy to some of the claims that President Trump and others have made that Google is suppressing conservative viewpoints. I just don't think there's evidence of that. But the Google search and other Google services are incredibly powerful. They are incredibly influential in what we see and read or don't see and read. And we just don't really know what gets baked into the algorithm that determines those things. And that causes, naturally, suspicion, and it should.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Mark Rotenberg of the Electronic Privacy Information Center and Bloomberg's Shira Ovide, thank you both for joining. Slack Technologies is actively gearing up for an IPO in the first half of next year, according to reporting by the Wall Street Journal. The offering could see the workplace messaging app valued at more than $7.1 billion, according to the report, which would make it one of the biggest tech IPOs since Snap went public in 2017. The company has raised almost $1.3 billion since it launched in 2013 and has more than 8 million active users every day. Coming up, surgeon, biotech entrepreneur, and more recently, owner of the LA Times, billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong wears many hats. Now he may be revolutionizing the energy sector. We'll discuss next. And still to come, asteroid mining may be just around the corner. How one mission by the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency would change the way we think about getting precious resources in space. This is Bloomberg. Over 100 years ago, Thomas Edison attempted to create batteries from zinc. The technology was unsuccessful, and since then, lithium-ion batteries have become the norm for electric cars, solar panels, and wind turbines. But while electric cars and solar panels become more and more common, lithium batteries are using up scarce minerals and heavily contributing to our carbon footprint. Now, Nant Energy is announcing the development of the first rechargeable zinc air battery, and CEO Patrick Soon-Shiong, who also owns the LA Times, says they will make use of abundant resources at significantly lower costs than lithium. Patrick, thank you for joining us. First of all, give us a little bit of a history lesson. A century ago, Thomas Edison tried to pioneer this technology. What were the limits that he hit on?
Well, it's exciting that 100 years ago he filed the first patent, right? And the issue for zinc being one of the most safe material is the issue of rechargeability. The problem with zinc, as you try to recharge it, it grows these things called dendrites that shorts out the battery, and that problem could never be solved.
So lithium ion is responsible for all sorts of environmentally friendly technologies, from wind turbines to solar panels. Remind us what the problem is with them.
Well, if you think of lithium, lithium ion actually requires cobalt. So lithium is a combination of two rarely available metals. Cobalt is very toxic. It's mined, sadly, in the Congo. Lithium, when you put it together, requires cooling. It's expensive. And it creates fires with explosions. So there's multiple downsides to the issue of lithium, and I think zinc will be the new lithium.
Well, but surely the supply of zinc is not abundant and endless. You know, I've seen some predictions that there's maybe a 20 or 25-year supply. You know, how do you go about sourcing zinc responsibly?
Zinc is one of the most abundant mineral metals, is 24th most abundant metals on the Earth's crust. So unlike lithium or cobalt, it's not only abundant, it's actually essential for you and I to live. It's essential for prenatal growth, it's essential for all your living cells. It's actually essential for you to make insulin. So it's one of these materials that is not only natural. If you combine it with natural occurring oxygen, photons from the sun, you have entirely green energy.
So Patrick, talk about the applications of the new batteries. Do you expect that we see those deployed by utilities in our electric automobiles soon? Where does Nant Energy view the first application?
Well, the first application we think is, and we've done this, by going into countries that are actually, if you look at the map at night, Africa and Asia, there's no electricity. So imagine giving a child the ability to read at night instead of a kerosene lamp. And so diesel, kerosene, lead acid, these are the things we want to replace right off the bat. And we can do that, have done that. We are now in 110 communities where, frankly, 110 villages where 200,000 people are completely off the grid. Where we're going next is also cell towers. And if you look at cell towers, one of the most exciting stories for us is that Duke Energy, and that was just reported yesterday in the New York Times, Duke Energy has now decided to give 13 acres of land back because our system has been running there through Florence and even through Irma. And now the ability for cell towers, and we have over 1,000 cell towers deployed, including in Mexico. With 5G coming, and there's going to be a need for a great number of cell towers. The ability to put cell towers completely off the grid is a very exciting opportunity.
So Patrick, a hard pivot, as we call it in the news business. I want to just talk briefly about your ownership of the LA Times, which you took over earlier this year. What are your plans for the iconic paper?
Well, I think it is an iconic paper. It's a 136-year-old paper that we actually not only need to grow, but thrive. And I think we need to go from a paper to a media, and that's what we'll be doing. But more importantly, continue to build what I consider great stories, great journalism, great investigative reporting. And I'm really proud about the people that stayed, and more excited by the work that Norm has done, Norm Pearlstein, the executive editor, and has helped now recruit some very exciting talent to the paper. So we're on the spree to hire and bring on the best talent and actually make this a very strong paper again.
And briefly, earlier this week, I heard you call social media a cancer on society. I can't imagine that the online discussion this week around events in Washington and elsewhere has changed your mind about that.
No, look, I think to be clear, it's really more deep than that. It's the issue of fake news and the idea of fake news being the cancer, and the idea of how do we actually, because of social media, spread information and as a form of metastasis. And the idea then, if we can actually differentiate truth and from fake news, it is so important for the democracy. You know, I come from apartheid. I've lived in apartheid, understand how important we need to actually provide important, truthful information. And because of the unintended consequences of social media was modeled as an advertising model, how do you differentiate from opinion advertising versus actually truthful news?
Indeed.
And that's,
okay,
I think, is our responsibility.
Thank you. Nant Energy CEO Patrick Soon-Shiong, thank you for joining. Coming up, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency is beaming back photos from a rover on an asteroid millions of kilometers from Earth. Why this mission could be key for the future of interplanetary space travel. This weekend on Bloomberg Television, we bring you our best interviews from the week, including outspoken Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff from his Dreamforce conference this week on sharing his title and his thoughts on regulating the tech industry. Tune in this Saturday for the best of Bloomberg technology. This is Bloomberg. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, made history Saturday, becoming the first country to land unmanned rovers on an asteroid. Launched in 2014, the goal is to bring back a sample from beneath the surface of the RE-UGA asteroid 280 kilometers from Earth. As part of the mission, they want to see if an asteroid could have brought water to Earth. This week, 2 hopping rovers from the mission sent back images. Some say this mission is a first step towards the future business of asteroid mining. Here to discuss is Tom Risen, reporter at Aerospace America. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I spoke in a separate interview with JAXA President Hiroshi Yamakawa. He's very excited about the scientific exploration to see if asteroids brought organic matter or water molecules to prehistoric Earth. But he also knows that the techniques being used by the Hayabusa 2 spacecraft, which is orbiting Ryugu right now, could be used for asteroid mining one day.
Tom, I thought Han Solo and Empire Strikes Back taught us to never land on an asteroid.
Well, JAXA has tried this before. They sent the Hayabusa 1 to an asteroid 2005. It got there,
and what happened?
They tried to send a very similar rover to the asteroid, and it flew off into space. So, you know, second time's the charm. They sent 2 of them this time. It worked. But this is not easy because the gravity on the asteroid is very weak.
Okay, so talk about the long-term promise of asteroid mining. I mean, I know the moon is also talked about as a potential hub to stop and mine fuel for other missions to Mars and beyond. So why would you want to land on an asteroid? Well, the first thing you have to realize about space economics is it costs a lot of money to take anything into space. A figure often cited is $10,000 per pound to launch anything out of Earth's atmosphere. Now, NASA and space companies are working to reduce that number, but you should still assume you're going to spend 10 grand per pound to get anything into space. Water can get really heavy, air can get really heavy, fuel can get really heavy. You can get all of those from water on the moon or water on asteroids. NASA has confirmed there is water ice in the shadows of craters along the polar regions of the moon. People have been talking about water ice within asteroids. So they're going to try to get those resources while they're already out of Earth's atmosphere. It'll save them a lot of money of shipping things back and forth in space. So do asteroids have advantages for this kind of fuel manufacturing that the moon does not? Well, the moon is often talked about, like Jeff Bezos, founder of rocket manufacturer Blue Origin, says he wants to send a lander to the moon by 2023. He's spoken about eventually turning water from the moon into rocket fuel because you have hydrogen, you have oxygen, you can synthesize that. Asteroids, there are companies like Deep Space Industries or Planetary Resources which have spoken about that. It's still a while away, and you got to remember, a lot of the asteroids are between Earth and Mars in that giant asteroid belt, and we still need to get humans to Mars. So these rovers are Japanese. Talk a little bit about why Japan has kind of led the effort here in the exploration of asteroid mining. Well, I think this is a sign of how the international space exploration is heating up. I think, because India sent a probe to the moon in 2008, which scientists used to confirm that there's water on, water ice at the polar regions. They had this spacecraft in 2008. JAXA sent a spacecraft to an asteroid a decade ago. I think that JAXA is very interested in, they founded their agency by merging the different aerospace corporations within Japan. So they're trying to do big things. They're also, they have this Bepi Colombo probe going to Mercury soon too. So they're stepping up. We've been talking about Elon Musk with regards to Tesla earlier today on the show, but he's also, of course, the CEO of SpaceX. If you're Elon and you're drawing up your plans to visit Mars one day, what do you take from today's news about this Japanese accomplishment? Well, he signed this Japan startup, iSpace, approached SpaceX about launching a lunar lander mission in 2021 and 2020 on Falcon 9 rockets. So SpaceX is involved. SpaceX is offering launch services, and you have to remember, the two big ways to make money off space right now are rockets and satellites. Asteroid mining could be a future business, but by providing launch services, SpaceX is in the game. Yeah, interesting to note the passenger on the forthcoming SpaceX orbital mission is also Japanese. Yes, I asked about that on the iSpace. They announced the iSpace deal with SpaceX, and they're just all very happy. It was interesting, this billionaire who founded the Zozo clothing retail site approached SpaceX. So people are coming to SpaceX with these. They're interested. They know that SpaceX is offering launch services, and they say, hey, I have this big daring plan to go to space. Let's do this. So let me ask you one last question about this JAXA mission. So we've got these incredible images. What do we still have to learn from the samples that it will bring back? There's a lot that can be learned. They haven't collected a subsurface sample before. They're going to release a blasting cap in orbit around the asteroid. The Hayabusa 2 is going to get out of the way, and it's going to create a crater. It's going to shoot a projectile at this asteroid and create a crater and collect the first subsurface sample from an asteroid. So there's a lot they can learn, see if there's water molecules, if there's organic compounds. That would tell us a lot about what an asteroid is made of and what it's like, and then we can plan from there. Fascinating. Okay, Tom Risen with Aerospace America. Thank you for joining us. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Brad Stone. This is Bloomberg.